Welcome to another episode of Lore Before Bed. In this episode we will look at Firekeepers, but as well as some of their stories, the main focus will be on their unique connection to humanity and consequences of it. The Firekeepers are all women, and none of them have had an easy time. The Dark Moon Knightess is disfigured, another has her tongue cut out and is locked in a cage. What is interesting is that the Dark Moon Knightess hides her face in her helmet. In-game data shows that her face is not literally disfigured, but they didn't expect us to be removing helmets, and so if the canon lore was taken literally, and we ignore constraints on game design perfection, she would have a disfigured face. Interestingly, Anastasia does not have a disfigured face, though she has been disfigured by human hands. One might say she's disfigured mentally as well. Even when we return her to life, and in doing so rescue her, since she is being respawned, there is some sort of healing process that occurs though. We do not know how this works. She wishes to not talk about the past, but look forward. She does not ask for rescue. So we have more than one Firekeeper, including the Fair Lady, all of whom suffer for the sake of their role. Not asking for escape is one thing, but listen to the item description. Her soul is gnawed by infinite humanity. One assumes this humanity is infinite because this is a bonfire, which is where humanity flocks via the undead. Why this humanity lives in the Firekeeper is very interesting. And why does it gnaw her? Of course, while we are warmed by the flame, we know it eventually turns us to ash, yet it seems that humanity also disfigures us. Is this why you need such self-sacrificing people to be a Firekeeper? Because humanity brings out the worst in them? Too much of it causes the worst human instincts to come forward, and so you need someone like Anastasia who, even after being killed by Lordran, still does her duty. Whether or not the church manipulated her is not really the point. She believes that what she is doing is good, and so she is not corrupted by humanity. We hope you're enjoying this episode of Lore Before Bed. We actually have a whole playlist of this sleepy content, ad-free, for Hawkshaw's supporters. YouTube sadly doesn't like the format and punishes the whole channel if they're public, but through your support, we are able to continue creating these relaxed discussions around a bonfire. For less than $1, you can get access to new Lore Before Bed videos, not to mention everything else on offer, which includes early access to our videos, and even being able to have your own theories looked at by fellow lore enthusiasts in video format on the channel. We hope you'll consider supporting what we do. Thank you. Did Firekeepers originally intend to take a more active role? In game, they simply stand by the fire we can kindle ourselves. In other games, we have evidence that the fires were raked or tended to, and in Demon Souls we have the Maiden in Black who is present, lighting the candles, caring for the space, casting spells, and leveling you up. In Elden Ring, Melina gives us the power of runes each time we level up, yet the Firekeepers in Dark Souls are very minimal. Again, this could have been a bit like the Wandering Black Knights, who due to complexity stayed in one place, and the Firekeepers, with so many of them, the moving parts of creating each one being able to interact with the fire was too difficult. We have speculated in the past whether the dragon in Ash Lake is a Firekeeper. The reasons for this is you cannot expect someone else to be keeping the fire, and it is very well tended to. It is already kindled to +10 on our arrival. An ancient dragon would be ignored by infinite humanity, as they themselves are infinite, unchanging, and unaffected by disparity unless they are destroyed by it. This dragon is definitely a pure ancient dragon, and so we don't really know if the role of Firekeeper is what Miyazaki intended. Certainly, it would fit the desire to transcend to dragon held by the dragon worshippers, seeking to bridge the gap from humanity to dragon. The choice of a dragon tending a bonfire in which to burn their humanity would certainly fit this theme. And finally, on the topic of Firekeepers, although he is male and not literally a Firekeeper, Gwyn is a fire protector. He guards the first flame from us. But it is with might, not with gentleness, and while he did sacrifice himself for the sake of the fire, he does not have to live in suffering in the same way as other Firekeepers, conscious and in pain. Gwyn is undead and has lost his mind. The Firekeepers have had to endure their suffering for the sake of the flames every day. The next thing to examine in Dark Souls is the relationship with giants. Historically, there seems to be some sense that giants came before lords or humans. The definition and difference is ambiguous in the first place, but it is certainly a consistent theme of From Software. In Elden Ring, it seems the Titans came first, and that things in general have shrunk as time goes on. Dark Souls more universally seems to have shrinking beings, especially wyverns compared to ancient dragons. The less powerful you are, the smaller you become. And yet the larger things are often treated as brutish, as if it was only a physical power they possessed. The deepest tombs in Nito's domain, and Nito himself, seem to be of giant size. The first of the dead could therefore have been a giant, but also if going in the sense of earliest buried, you would expect them to be deeper, and so the giants could have come first. What you therefore have is a potential ancestor, but then this is odd considering they are so disrespected. To disrespect the ancestors is not typical of medieval fantasy. There is also a big difference between giants. Hawkeye is extremely wise and well-spoken, whereas his friend the blacksmith is not. They also look very different. So if humans are the lowest of the low, why are giants disrespected too? Why are they slaves in Sen's fortress? There is no evidence of them fighting on the battlefield against the dragons apart from Goth. So had they already been overcome by the lords and the humans? Nito, who seems giant-like, is the most likely to have had any giant soldiers, but he is not shown with troops. He attacks the dragons on his own, which is interesting in and of itself, for it shows the disparity may not have spread as much as expected. So the giants may have ruled while the non-dragon creatures were still pretty marginalised, and then once the lords conquered they became slaves, or similar to slaves throughout the Age of Fire. Hawkeye Goth was rewarded for showing his prowess in the war against the dragons, but this was still under the leadership of Gwyn. Added to all this ambiguity is the fact that From Software simply didn't achieve what they wanted with giants in Dark Souls 1. It's obviously something they were unhappy with because they continued with giants as a main theme in Dark Souls 2, and again in Dark Souls 3, though not as heavily. As though wanting to correct the error of the earlier game. Another confusing thing about the giants is their faces. We actually do not see a giant's face in Dark Souls 1. We didn't think to notice this at the time. Many characters have helmets on, and there are very few giants. If there had been 50 giants with helmets on, this would have led to speculation. But Dark Souls 2 surprised us with giant faces. We do not know if it was intended that giants had different faces from the very beginning. Certainly, Nito himself has a skull that is giant-sized. Within the Tomb of the Giants, there are giant skeletons, which have a skull which would imply a nose and eyes. But the living giants were always blocked by helmets. Whether it's the slaves upon Sen's fortress, or whether it's Goth or the blacksmith, we never get to see a giant's face. This left From Software with scope for the sequels, in which they had the very interesting creative choice of a hole for a face. We don't know what the consensus is on this concept, or what the potential allegory means. Does this mean Goth had a similar face? And how did the giants see? Was Goth always blind? It would seem that there really is resin on his helmet, and other giant enemies are not blind. Sometimes the transition to Dark Souls 2 was a little jarring, and we think one reason was the creative license taken with the gaps created in Dark Souls 1. If you technically haven't said something in the lore, it doesn't mean that the gap should be overexploited. For example, we know Seath created the Moonlight Butterfly and the Crystal Golems, but that doesn't mean that because it hasn't been categorically ruled out that he did not create other creatures, that we should have Stardust Bears and Horned Sea Snakes. Dark Souls 2 did far too much of this very thing. The slavery theme continues into Dark Souls 2 where there was a giant uprising. We don't feel it was especially well resolved, and we still don't really know the place of giants. Combining this with the fact that the pygmy and the role of the pygmy in humans, and the difference between them and the lords is still ambiguous, makes us feel this is all allegory. The differences between humans and lords may be a symbol for some difference in the way of life as well as power. We have some ideas about what it means when it's said that Lord Artorias is very easily corrupted by humanity because he does not have much dark within him. We think Miyazaki is sending a message about beings of light and beings of dark. We will be getting to that in other content. Elden Ring, though some might mistakenly call it shallow, actually suffers from perhaps too much fleshing out. It's like entering something with many moving parts, or swimming on the top of the deep sea compared to a shallow bay. There is much more of a sense of culture between humans and demi-humans, even if it is not explicitly stated, when compared to giants and lords in Dark Souls. It's not literally stated, but we can get a feeling for the social currents. They probably learnt from the confusing and difficult balance of having gigantic creatures who were ruled by those much smaller than them, and chose to have the titans already buried in the earth and of the distant past. Elden Ring is a good example of depth being its own enemy. We hope the community realises how interesting the lore is, as it can suffer from its own breadth. Let's see if time tells and Elden Ring becomes a long-term success, or is slightly forgotten like Sekiro lore. We look forward to exploring it with you. Thank you for joining for this episode of Lore Before Bed. For more relaxed lore discussions, consider supporting the channel for less than $1 to get access to new videos, all ad-free. There is also early access to videos, and even being able to have your own theories featured in video format on the channel. Your support allows us to keep making this content, so thank you.